Hi, I'm Bob Greaves, and I have a show here at the place called The Unconventional Pastor, and I would love it if I could get your participation in the show with your questions and your comments by video. Your question or comment can be something about the Bible, theology, maybe something you saw on an earlier show, or something you read in my blog. Here's what I'd like you to do. Make a video in as high quality as you can of yourself asking the question or making the comment. After you've made your video, upload it to Facebook, YouTube, or someplace else where I can find it and make it public or private. Then you can send me a private message in Facebook that includes a link to your video. In your message, make sure that you include your full name spelled correctly. I'm kind of excited about sharing as many of your questions and comments as I can possibly fit in the show. On behalf of the New Covenant Group, I'd like to thank you for your participation in making this show even better. I'm hoping that tonight you will also participate as much as you can and send in your comments. You can text them in. You can leave comments in on the Ustream. There are various different ways that you can make contact, and some of that information will appear at the very bottom of the screen. Now, tonight I plan to talk about some of the ideas that have made sense to me, and that are some of the ideas that some people think make me unconventional. And I want to reiterate a couple of things here. One is that, I'm not trying to be unconventional. I don't see being unconventional as an appropriate goal, and but I do see being honest. I also think that it's important that we be who we are. I believe in a unity of the faith, but I believe that unity comes by us all going through a process that recognizes how we are one as a family, how we are one in love, and that as we grow together in thinking in ways that are similar, if we ever do, it can only happen as the result of a process of honesty. I think that it is a great violation of faith and a dishonest faith for us to try to find people we trust and then start conforming the way we think to them. And in a similar manner, I would have to say that I don't want you to do that with me. If the things that I say make sense, then, consider them. If they don't make sense, then, it's not for you, or at least not for you at this time. And who knows, maybe in time, some of these ideas I'll modify. And so what's important is this: if we will each be honest with ourselves, recognize the serious difficulties and problems in how we think, it's a process and we'll get there. But then the other thing is this, I'm a thinker. It's part of who I am. It's part of my personality. But this isn't a contest. This isn't something where there's going to be a test. It is something, life is something where if there are issues over which you have no opinion, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to have an opinion about things. But one thing that I do think distinguishes Christianity more than anything else, it is a quest of authentic love. And that is not a doctrine. It's not an intellectual concept, although we do have to struggle with what it might mean. It has something to do more with something we can't even always define. When we find our fellow human being to be precious in a very beckoning and compelling way, and we find that it causes us to desire their well-being and to be honest with ourselves about whether or not the way we think and behave is really good for all of us. So love has more to do with this than concept or doctrine. But because, I'm a thinker, it's part of what I do. But I'll tell you something. I would give it all up and just pursue love. But the one reason I don't, well, I guess there's two reasons. One is I'm a thinker. I can't stop doing it. It's just part of who I am. But the reason why I pursue it is because I think there's so many ideas out there that I find hindering, damaging, perhaps some of them even well-intended and some of them not, that I feel that I need to be expressive of some of these ideas so that I can kind of hit some of these bad ideas in the Achilles heel and kind of knock them down. Not to be violent, but to allow people who oftentimes find themselves oppressed by ideas that they don't understand why those ideas are so oppressive. That, hearing the way other people think might actually give them a moment of, oh, aha, I get it. I see that now. Okay. And then they experience this sense of freedom, a sense of being able to just let go of the concerns and worries so that they can give a lot of these ideas up. Now, in some of the ideas that I've talked about, a big, strong one for me is this idea, and I've actually written some of these things down, and I resisted writing it down because I'm not a big, strong believer in this idea of a statement of faith. I particularly don't care for statements of faith for organizations. Maybe people, but not organizations. Organizations are just people getting together, and when you have an organization with a statement of faith, it becomes a little bit too controlling, a little bit too restrictive. I can see an organization having a sense of mission, a sense of vision, a particular organizational goal. But that is something that usually people who join that organization are already interested in doing, and it has more to do with getting certain tasks completed. It doesn't have anything to do with how we view the world necessarily and things like that. But anyway, here's one of my big, strong things. Christianity, it's not a belief system. It isn't. If anything, it's a subjective discovery of living loved and discovering what it really means to be near Christ, to have the presence of God with you, within you, around you, about you, to realize that we live in His very face. He's very pleased with us, that He enjoys our presence, and to Christianity is trust in the very person of Jesus. It's a very personal thing, and that is the kind of thing you can do without really necessarily understanding what it is or what it means. And so, although we do have a number of things that we say we believe, and I think it's unavoidable to have some of them, Christianity is not primarily a belief system. So it's kind of odd if you think it's not a belief system to then have a statement of faith. And so really my statement of faith is kind of like an answer to other statements of faith. But very strong in my list of ideas is this idea that Christianity is not a belief system. It's a subjective discovery of what it means to live loved by God, to discover myself lovely, to discover others lovely, and to discover that our Heavenly Father has created us in a way that makes us very wonderful existences. Being human is marvelous, a marvelous opportunity, and that a great deal of the things that we struggle, the things we struggle with become far more easier to work with when we realize who it is we are. In fact, I've often said this, that the temptations that we see that Jesus goes through, some people say, okay, well, the first one was, command these stones be made bread, because he was hungry. But and then, oh, no, 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 no. See, jump off the pinnacle of the temple, kind of show off. And then the third one being, oh, I can give you all these kingdoms of the world. But those aren't the temptations of Jesus. Those are just the opportunities. The real temptation for Jesus, as I see it there in the text, is this: if you are the Son of God, then prove it. Reassure yourself, reassure others. Turn it into an issue. And I really think that Christianity is about the discovery that who we already are as children of God, as people created by Him, loved by Him, made beautiful by Him, filled with the potential and filled with the future that we have. That discovering this is the end of any kind of eternal agenda, of any kind of deep, dark concern about how this is all going to end up, even though life itself still has many, many challenges and need to be handled with responsibility and various other things. Our Christian life is really not a belief system. It's living loved. And, as I go along with that, another statement that I've made here in my own personal statement of faith is this idea that faith is not a mental assent to propositional truths or a confidence in God. So I don't like to think of faith as, well, I believe this, and and I don't believe that, and I believe that. That's not my faith. That's the sense I make of things. But my faith is that positive aspect of being drawn to the reality of this presence of Christ and allowing that receptivity to that activity of the indwelling Christ to be what is at work in me. That there's this openness to His presence, even when I don't know what that means or how that works or what I should do about it, if anything. There's this openness to it. And that's more what I understand to be faith. It's like when I sit down in a chair, I allow myself to give my weight to the chair without worrying about whether or not, can this chair hold me? If I have faith in the chair, I sit down in it. If I have faith in God, I abide in His presence. It's just a way of being. And so I don't see faith as being an assent to propositional truths or to some sort of confidence that I think He knows what He's doing and I think He's going to pull it off. Well, I do, but I'm just committed to the fact that He is there, and all these other things are part of it. But it's not necessarily some concept that I'm okay. All right, we're okay now. I can relax because I believe He can do this. That's not necessarily the idea. It is really this active openness to God. You see, faith is a work, in a sense, of participation in the options that are before me, sustained by Christ, whose personal activity actually creates them. And it's kind of an openness to this idea of what's going on. We're transformed by our faith. I meant to say this. We're not transformed by our faith per se. Rather, we're transformed by the activity of Christ that we have received, in a sense, by faith. This openness that we have, but the transformation in our lives, the sense of security that we have, the love that we experience, that is something that comes to us from God, from Christ. And it's not the sort of thing that faith creates or makes happen. Faith is not the key that unlocks the door. It's not the magic button. It's really more when you've seen something and it's there and your brain just merely goes, oh, it's there. I see that. I'm going to work with that. It looks like I might have a comment coming in. Let's take a look, see what we got. Viewer comment, Romans 10:9, thoughts. That one always trips me up. Always bad news for the mute. Okay, Romans 10:9. I haven't memorized every verse of Scripture. I'm being a little facetious here. There's a lot of Scripture I'm not familiar, but I'm going to take a look at this Romans 10:9. I think when I look at it, I'm going to say, oh yeah. Anyway, I've got a Bible right here that I look at, and let's see, Romans 10 and verse 9. Let's see what we got here. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Well, you know, I knew that number. I used to do this thing called the Romans Road years ago. You know, you lead someone to Christ, and they call it the Romans Road because you start, and I guess it's been so long since I've even done anything like that. I can't remember how the weather worked. But, you have to go through these various verses. First, you got to establish the fact that they're a sinner, and then you got to establish this and that, and then how they do this and all that. And I think this is one of those verses that we used in it. Of course, we want to take a look a little more at the context here to take a look at what we're saying here. Moses describes it in this way, that righteousness that is by the law, a man who does these things will live by them, but righteousness that is by faith says, do not say in your heart, we will ascend to heaven. That is to bring Christ down, or who will descend to the deep, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But it does say, the word is near you, it is in your mouth, it is in your heart. That is the word of faith we are proclaiming. That if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Well, first of all, I don't like this word saved. I think that this is a really bad translation. There's a concept that we all approach life not knowing what the risks are. And we can sometimes not be sure that it's safe. I think this is more of what it's talking about. And even here when it's saying, the word that is in your mouth, and it says, and in your heart. By the way, the word heart there is a word that is really referring to the core. This was a concept of the Hebrew idea that the very center of yourself, the very core of yourself, the heart here in Scripture has nothing to do with emotions. It has nothing to do with love and all that. The word heart has to do with who you are at the deepest part of yourself. That when the reality of who Christ is and what's going on here reaches to your core. Jesus even said the things that are in the heart is, the abundance of those things is what the mouth speaks. This is likely to, come out in your speech, but I don't really perceive this as being some sort of a formula whereby, okay, let me try this. Okay, I confess Jesus is Lord. I mean, the whole idea that this is kind of almost like witchcraft. It's like if I give the proper incantation, then oh my goodness, I have God over a barrel, and he now has to save me. I don't think God has to save me. I think I need to know that I am safe. And I can come to know that I am safe by experiencing this reality of who Christ is and realizing by the time it reaches the core of myself, it's really okay. It really is. Now, last week I was actually talking, it was Sunday, I was talking about it, where we were, let's see, I'm trying to remember exactly how I said it last time, this idea of safe. Well, I can't remember what I said, but we'll get back to that maybe later. Got another one. And we have one comment saying, my faith is in absolute love. I would agree with that. We have discovered that the foundation of how reality is going to all consummate is guaranteed by this character of God that we find in this word love. And then we discover that we are safe. I remember what I was going to say, that Jesus spent some time with his disciples, but it's not until he's approaching the end that he even broaches the question with them. Who do you say that I am? Jesus was not in any hurry to get them to being saying, you are Lord. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. We were in no hurry to get there. He spent his time with them. He lived with them. He loved with them. They went through various situations together. He ministered to other people. They saw the healings. They saw the unusual things. They saw the way he talked to and responded to the questions that came his way, the way he spoke to the religious leaders. they began to see in him the thing that kind of grew on them. And it finally gets to the point where Peter, when asked, "Who do you say that I am?" he goes, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." This was something that Peter discovers as so, not just something he formulaically says in response. And in some ways, I think that these verses from Romans are really along those lines, that when we abide in God, we come to that point where the truth of this, as to what's really going on, that there's nothing for us to do. We don't have to get Christ out of hell. We don't have to rise up there to somehow pull him down and say, "Hey, remember me." No. The reason and the sense of this, and the thing that's going to actually come out of our mouths spontaneously, I guess, is this idea that's really reaching down to the core of our beings, that he's Christ and he is the Lord, and we're safe. And so I think that I would see it more in that kind of a way. Romans 10:9. Thanks for that. That's a good verse to use to talk about contrasting this idea. I think that we've grown so accustomed to reading the Bible and seeing it translated with such hyperbole that we've got this narrative that we're running on and maintaining and sustaining through the way we read it, the way we hear it, the way we translate it, that we end up turning it into something that I don't think really works well for us. It more sits on our back. Another idea of something that comes from my personal statement of faith that I finally put together. It took me a long time. I mean, people asked me for it, and I didn't want to give it, and they asked me, and then I said, well, finally, okay. And this was just less than a year ago, I finally put one together. But I find it absurd to believe that a person's personal, eternal destiny is contingent upon their submission to a truth that cannot be independently verified and requires figuring it out in spite of its association with a bunch of crap that other people have been talking about, and all the kinds of misrepresentations that have happened, and the problems with scientific breakthroughs, and every generation fighting the realities and calling people who know what they're talking about instruments of Satan. And the last 2,000 years, all the problems that Christianity has had in being honest with reality, that somehow our eternal destiny is going to depend upon whether or not, in spite of all that nonsense, we can still break through it all and say, "Oh no, Jesus is the Lord." When it's in that kind of a context, I find it absolutely absurd to believe that a person's eternal destiny in any manner has to be held contingent upon an assertion that is so burdened with problems that we, people who claim to be believers, have really bundled with the message. And this is something I just can't see how that is. It doesn't even make good philosophical sense. It strikes me as arbitrary, irresponsible, and unloving. And I can't reconcile that message with what strikes me as the revealed character of God, as seen both in Christ and in the things that he had to say, and in the way that people have really experienced the presence of God, who have even come to Christ, and many who have experienced that presence not knowing who it is. But believing the gospel now just only determines who gets to subjectively appreciate and understand this reality of Christ in their lives. And in a very real sense, I can put it this way: I dislike necessarily associating myself with specific kinds of movements or specific kinds of teachings, but I would have to put myself in the camp of those people who call themselves ultimate universal reconciliationists, and that I believe that the love of God is involved in the process of bringing back and restoring what has fallen away, or what just hasn't yet properly developed, in spite of all of the obstacles that we are putting in our ways, or struggling with, or trying to work our way through. Something else that I've had in my statement of faith that I thought might be interesting to talk about is the Mosaic Law. I realize that a lot of Christians today have this concept that the Ten Commandments and the Old Testament law is somehow a revelation of God's righteousness, and that this is the real righteousness of God. But because we couldn't live up to it, God, being a nice guy, came down and was our substitute for us, so that God didn't have to give in to this strong, passionate urge that he had, because he can't stand the stench of our souls. He gives us Christ, and now this real law that's behind Moses and this thing, this real law is somehow now bypassed. That is kind of like a bypass operation, where we get to experience the forgiveness and grace of God, quite in spite of the fact that we actually really deserve the full brunt of the law. I don't believe that. I find that to be absolutely absurd. I believe that the Mosaic Law was actually a very superficial, shallow representation of God's character. The Mosaic Law has been annulled. It was never really valid. Now, it certainly made a lot of good sense at the time, and it does say some things that really kind of address the issues, but it has nothing to do with what's really behind those issues, or what really solves them, or what really causes them. It just sounds good to people who think, well, hey, you got some problems there, stop doing it. It doesn't work, because we weren't designed that way. The only valid law is God's character of love. That's the only law that has ever been the law. And what we find is that I personally believe that the Old Testament law, as it were, and I'm not really even sure on this. I'm entertaining a couple of possibilities. One is, I think the Old Testament law was God saying to himself, as it were, man is really struggling here, and he's not really ready or open to what's really going to solve this. He's got to recognize, mankind, that there's only one way this is going to work. But before we can make that one way work, we've got to eliminate contending possibilities. And one of the things that's going to make a lot of sense to human beings is this idea of thou shalt not, thou shalt, and all this other stuff. So why don't we do that, give that the best try we can, and when we show that it doesn't work and it can't, then they'll be ready for something else that really, really does work. So I perceive the Mosaic Law as probably being an experiment intended to fail, so that we can, okay, look, we really gave that a good try and it didn't work. Now we know the love of God is the only way we can really live. I got a few more comments here. That no one seeks after God line in chapter 3 is also irksome. Then it's actually a quote from the Old Testament. There's none that seeks after God, no, not one. Can you blame them? Given the character of what's going on here, God is a very presented in the Old Testament as a very, very scary person, as a very scary entity. And it seems to me that most people would really seek after them, would seek after him because they're trying to get on his good side, lest they be on his bad side. And I would want to argue that from a real standpoint, that when you stop to think about it, that's very selfish. If I'm coming to God only because he won't squash me like a bug, and I can maybe get out of that fate by, buttering him up and kind of sucking up to God, I guess. And it's really a survival strategy. That's horrible. I can't imagine. Why? How could anybody really seek after God that way? I don't. Now I don't know that verse actually means that nobody really seeks after God, but I think nobody can really seek after that kind of a God and find that to be the kind of thing it's working. But anyway, what I was saying is that the Mosaic Law, it was either one of these experiments that was designed to fail, or it was an experiment that the Mosaic cult of Yahweh a fake and false religion was going through, and God decided, hey, this is a good way to get going and get started on this, to turn this around. So God infiltrates that religion, as it were, actually sends prophets, actually gets involved in it, but and gives it some inertia, spurs it on, but kind of builds in a monkey wrench that causes it to finally have these prophecies that then Christ fulfills, and so then through Christ we begin to see who God really is, and we uncover this lie that was the cult of Yahweh. Now, I don't know which of those is true, and it doesn't really matter to me. One thing I've become totally convinced of is that the Mosaic Law is not a representation of God's character. It never really was the real law, and it can't be. And not only that, but if it really were the real law, then God has no right to suspend it. It's not gracious of him to do so. It condemns us in an eternal uselessness, where we have a grace. It is an offense to both God and to man for that to be the case. The real case is this: we are made in his image. We are lovely. We have fallen. We don't know who we really are. We can discover who we really are, and discover we're really safe. And so the Mosaic Law is something that I reject as possessing a genuine validity, an authenticity. It just doesn't possess. Another aspect of my statement of faith was that I ate an apple, and I got some apple skin. No, that's actually from the salad that I ate. Something in my mouth there. Our lifestyle is to be, filled with the Spirit, we say. What does that mean? I've entertained a lot of notions, and I'm not really sure always what that means, but I take it to mean that we are to live conscious of this presence that we are in, this presence of the indwelling Christ. And when I say the indwelling Christ, I use that as a phrase. To be honest with you, I don't really know if location makes sense here. Maybe it doesn't, but we talk about the indwelling Christ, and I don't know whether that's a metaphor or a reality. I really don't know, and I don't really care, because in spirit, I just don't know how location really works, and that's not my problem either. God knows what he's doing, I guess. He created all of this, and this is the way it works, so he's got it well at hand. But anyhow, to live in this presence of the indwelling Christ with an openness to allowing the Christ-like character to be expressed in all that we do. When we live loved, we begin to become aware of how we are not the only ones who can live loved, and we find ourselves wanting to live in a way where others can experience the token, in a sense, of our own love. In fact, I'll tell you something. This preaching the gospel stuff, I suppose there is a sense in which we have to give a framework of what's going on, who Jesus is, tell the story, create a narrative. But you know what? In life, I've discovered something, that people don't make their decisions that way. They really don't. In fact, I remember it was back in the years when I was still a fundamentalist. I went to Practical Bible Training School to take a few courses because I had some time. And I took a course there called The Kingdom of the Cults, and took that course, and we studied a variety of different splinters off of Christianity into some of the obtuse ideas that do exist out there. And for my class project, I actually talked to and interviewed a wide variety of people who belonged to some of these organizations that we had identified as cults. And I asked them, so how did you make this decision? And I found that when I spoke to Christians, almost all the time when I'd speak to Christians who were fundamentalists, they said, why did you come to Christ? They would usually give me this dissertation of, I thought about it, and I came to this point where I realized that Jesus is this and that, and the Bible is, and blah, 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 and they talked about this paradigm. And I got to be honest with you, I'm not so sure they're being honest. But when I spoke to some of these people who belong to these other organizations, they were actually far more honest with me. I remember one time I talked to a guy. His name was Bishop Brett. He was a bishop in a couple of different stakes of a Mormon stake. They don't call them churches, I don't think. But anyway, so he was the bishop there, and he was very gracious in giving me an interview, and we talked to him about Mormonism and all this other stuff. And when I asked him, I said, "How did you become a Mormon?" His answer really was that he was in college. He lived with his family. They were Mormons. And he was so impressed with the way this family just loved each other, the emphasis they had on Monday night of a family night. And he was so touched by the love they had that he embraced them and their culture and their people, as it were. And I find that many times this is exactly how people make a decision to involve themselves with a group of people who possess a particular faith, whatever it is, that when they feel these people care, when they feel these people love them. And although I do think that some cults will use, loving people up and trying to just, really butter them up as a way of kind of drawing them in, and I can be a manipulative thing, I do think that preaching the gospel, as it were, is going to be far more effective if we love people. And if we love people, we have to love them in a way where what we're doing for them and loving them has absolutely nothing to do with whether they ever become believers. That's not our agenda. Our agenda, if somebody's hungry and they need food, our agenda should be find a way to get them some food. They need something that they don't have. Find a way of getting them to have it. If they actually perhaps need some character, helping them to develop some character. If maybe they need to, maybe sometimes even in wisdom discover that they need to take responsibility for some of the things they've done. Help them to do that, but without condemning them and recognizing that, treat them like a decent, dignified human being who has every capability of being everything they were ever created to be, and loving them and valuing them. And that in doing this, that when they sense that they are truly, genuinely and honestly regarded as dignified and wonderful and beautiful and lovely and worthwhile, if there's anything that you have to say about what you believe, they'll be all ears. They'll listen. They'll consider it. They'll embrace it if they can. So our lifestyle, I'd say, is to, be conscious of this presence that we live in, and to express this character of Christ in all that we do. And that character, of course, is summed up in love. Viewer comment, can you speak a bit more about the cult of Yahweh? Sure. Now, of course, I'm using that I'm using the word cult in the anthropological sense. I'm not using it in the popular sense of like, these people are just all about control. I think that in the ancient world, we sometimes don't appreciate how vulnerable and difficult life was. And so I think that sometimes when we see their authoritarianism, we don't realize how close to death you are if you're not part of a group that's doing this and doing there, and where they have the various aspects of their culture going on. Although we live in a day where we can certainly enjoy far more easygoingness and peace. So I'm not using the word cult in that way, but I'm using it in the anthropological sense. It's a group of people who perceive this entity they call Yahweh, and that they shape their culture and their identity with each other as a corporate body around this personality called Yahweh. And when I talk about the cult of Yahweh, what I'm saying is that, various different religious ideas and notions develop throughout the world. Personally, I believe that a lot of them really develop as the result of trying to explain near-death experiences, trying to explain other phenomena that just we don't know if we can make sense of them. And eventually we also discover the struggle of character. And we find the bliss of forgiveness, or of somehow that struggle of character being something that's no longer held against us. And I think this is part of what strives people towards some sort of spiritual or religious awareness. And I think that when I talk about the cult of Yahweh, I see this as one of those, man-made religions that that God kind of infiltrates and then takes over, and actually uses it as a stepping stone to cause it to cave in on itself over time, but also causes it to then lead to and suggest this messianic new covenant, the day that's coming when I will put my law in your hearts, and I will take out your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh, and that this old covenant was really then transformed into something that was actually going to be a promise of something different when they finally got to the point where they could culturally realize this just is not working. And so I hope that answers more your question about the cult of Yahweh. Thanks for the question. Thanks for the comment. I don't believe that our lifestyle is to be one of perfectionism. Perfectionism, now, that's really kind of somewhat hypocritical of me to say. I'm one of those modified perfectionists. I like to do the best I can. I aim at the best I can do. Sometimes I try to be as fastidious as I can, but I'm a modified perfectionist. Best effort I can do. Whatever turns out, hey, that's good enough for me. And so I use perfectionism in my aim, and I use serenity in the results. But our lifestyle is not one of perfectionism. Our lifestyle is one of abiding in Himism. That's more of what it is. We're not trying to become perfect. I don't need to become perfect. An apple sitting on a tree doesn't have to decide, I'm going to be the best apple I can be. If that apple is abiding in the vine and that tree is planted in a great place, that apple has a great future as an apple. And the same thing is true with us. We're made of awesome stuff. We are human beings. We have no clue yet just awesome and wonderful and valuable it is to be who and what we are. And simply abiding in the nurture of the love of God, living loved, this is going to bring about all the development we could ever need, and it's fine, and it's a natural outgrowth and fruit of that reality as we abide in it. It naturally tends toward attitudes such as, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and gentleness, and self-control. Those things about which Galatians says there's no law against them. Now, although it is true that we cannot create these attitudes if we have not experienced them somehow modeled towards us, these are the character traits that we find modeled and nurtured in those who love us and that we experience in the presence of Christ. The reason why these are fruits of the Spirit is because we find in God love. We find in God a real joy. He is so happy to be in our presence. It brings him great joy. He loves us the same way we love our own children. And when you see your children do things, it just does your heart good to see that. And peace. And he's not at war with us. He's not at war when you sense that with him. His patience. When are you going to finally get it? I think that we as human beings find patience sometimes trying. We do have a limited time, as it were, sometimes in this life, but we see the patience of God. We see that, my goodness, when you stop to think about it, it's been 2,000 years since Jesus was here, and that's pretty patient in terms of a lot of things that are going on. The kindness, when you see this graciousness and you experience all this goodness and faithfulness, when you see it coming from people who care about you, love you, value you, and you experience this as part of what's going on when you abide in Christ, then it just becomes second nature to begin behaving this way yourself as you've had it modeled to you. It's just a natural thing to do. It's part of what that means to abide in the vine. So we don't create these attitudes, and we don't try to muster up love or muster up. We just experience it and then just reflect it, and as it grows in us. We find these attitudes are part of the indwelling Christ. We have another wrap within 5. Yeah, oh well, isn't that the way it goes? I skipped several comments. Okay, let me see. That no one seeks after God. Okay, I'm about to nickname him Butter because he's on a roll. Thank you. I agree that we should read safe with thou shalt, just like just like the Greek, we are safe. For your comment, can you speak a little bit more? Okay, I think I got those comments then. Yeah. Okay, awesome. Now, we human beings, we're vulnerable and we're very dependent creatures. We really can't live entirely on our own on the physical and conscious planes. We can creatively modify our environments and engage in relationships, but unlike God, we can't create options that don't exist. And so we can only look to our physical and our social environment to modify the environment, to make changes. And that's all that we really need to do. Now, we might talk about how that's being very creative, and it is. But at the same time, we're creative by rearranging the things we find already. One more at the bottom. Okay, Vermi, can you speak a little bit more? Okay, you skipped several comments. Viewer comment. What is your definition of absolute love? What is my definition of absolute love? Well, I understand love to not be an emotion. I think that many emotions will attend love, but I think that love is an awareness. It is a consciousness. It is awareness of incredibly high value. It is an arresting awareness. It is the discovery that something, someone, is just unspeakably valuable in such a way as that it then motivates us. We find ourselves so motivated that we want to live in a way that celebrates that awesomeness, that value. It motivates us to want to live in such a way as we declare that value. You want to tell people, I think you're awesome. I think you're wonderful. You want to celebrate it and declare it, make it known. But also it motivates you to want to make sure that you don't do anything that would violate it or spoil it. And so I see love as being an awareness and a consciousness. Now, in that, there's also going to be a great deal of affection. In that, there's going to be a great deal of effort to nurture. In that, there's going to be, even at times, a great deal of disappointment and anger and a wide variety of every feeling that we are capable of having as it might be appropriate to the way we understand what's going on. There can be even a sense of indignation, a sense of justice when you see valuable human beings being abused. There'll be an anger and something like that. This violates this great value. And so I see love as more an awareness of this value. The discovery of just how valuable human beings are, this image of God in us. And it becomes something that we treasure. And so we grow attached to that, and we rest in it. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's more like the way that I would see that. Human beings are the loveliest aspect of God's creation. When God created human beings, he breathed into them the breath of his own life. And I think this is a great deal as to what it is, who we are, not just as biological beings, but who we are as conscious persons, is something that I don't think we can really exhaust an awareness of just how wonderful and precious this is. Anyhow, these are some of the ideas that I muse around with and I've thought about. And some of them I've tried to think, well, is it this, is it that? And some of them I've tried to choose words that might say it more clearly. And I do that just because I'm a thinker and try to be a thinker. And someone told me that if you're bald up here, it means you're a thinker. And if you're bald back here, it means you're a lover. And if you're bald all the way back, it just means you think you're a lover. But anyhow... So those are some of my ideas, and I hope that in sharing them, if there's anything in them that you find you can relate to and it works with you, that's wonderful. In the meantime, thank you so much, and I'll see you again on Sunday evening. Take care. Hi, I'm Bob Greaves, and I have a show here at the place called The Unconventional Pastor, and I would love it if I could get your participation in the show with your questions and your comments by video. Your question or comment can be something about the Bible, theology, maybe something you saw on an earlier show, or something you read in my blog. Here's what I'd like you to do. Make a video in as high quality as you can of yourself asking the question or making the comment. After you've made your video, upload it to Facebook, YouTube, or someplace else where I can find it, and make it public or private. Then you can send me a private message in Facebook that includes a link to your video. In your message, make sure that you include your full name spelled correctly. I'm kind of excited about sharing as many of your questions and comments as I can possibly fit in the show. On behalf of the New Covenant Group, I'd like to thank you for your participation in making this show even better.